and welcome. It's this time we consider the sixth week of the year with its readings. Basically, the gospel tradition today will continue that of Matthew chapter 5, verses this time 17 through 37. 20 different verses. We'll talk a little bit about this, a very significant section of the famous Sermon on the Mount, which we will be hearing and listening to again the next couple of weeks. Just in passing, the first reading comes from the book of Sirach, chapter 15, verses 15 through 20. And we continue to hear sections from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, this time chapter 2, verses 6 through 10. Now you will remember that the Sermon on the Mount began with the Beatitudes, followed by two images that we considered last time, the image of salt and light. And now, remembering that in Matthew's tradition, Jesus is pictured as the new teacher. Namely, he follows in the footsteps and the ways of Moses, of course, who had been considered to be the great teacher as well as the leader of the Israelites during their crisis years, coming out of the bondage of Egypt into the wilderness and then to the land of promise. That it was in the wilderness that Moses had received, when he had climbed up the mountain, the Torah, the law. Now, the translation of Torah for law is all right if one understands the Hebraic understanding of law here, not in the sense as we do in the legal situation so much, but rather a better translation would be the Torah is the instruction. In other words, helps in how Israel as a community should stay together and continue to learn more about its Redeemer, the Lord God, and the way in which as a community it would live out and could live out together its lives. So what we find now as we begin to look at Matthew's story are six cases. This will run through chapter 5, verses 21 through 47. Now, we are not going to hear all of these this time, and then next week we'll pick this up again. So as I said, we're getting a kind of continuation here of Matthew's essential points. These six cases will argue that love, compassion, and generosity that equal to trust are really the ways in which Matthew hopes his disciples will live out their following of his ways. There is evidence at this point that Jesus, when he looks at the law, never in any way repudiated his obligation to the law, to which both his birth and his circumcision committed himself. So it's important to notice, because some often, as historically, will interpret this as Jesus is replacing the law with his teaching. That is not the situation. We mentioned this last time. We need to mention it again, and probably will refer to it often in the future, that in this situation, Jesus is not creating a new religion or a new way of looking at things, but rather is taking the Torah, taking the instruction, and bringing it to a new level. This would be something that teachers or that rabbis in Judaism would frequently try to do. Not to do away with what was, but to bring it into a clearer or a more contemporary situation. So when Jesus is pictured as saying that I came not to change the law, not even the smallest letter of the law, and the word here in the Greek word is iota, I-O-T-A, and in Hebrew it's yod. So the smallest part of a letter of the law, and you have to have a little bit of an alphabet here to appreciate how small that little Yoda is. Jesus is saying to his followers, I'm not doing away with this, but I'm bringing it to a deeper level. Perhaps the word fulfillment is helpful here, or to perfection, as we mentioned last time, as long as perfection is not seen as a completed activity, but rather as an ongoing activity. The English here might better be perfecting rather than perfection. So what we will find here are the first of three cases that Jesus now, or is it Matthew, raises to see how the teaching of Jesus truly satisfies what we have just mentioned. Fulfilling the law, or the instruction, Jesus draws out its fullest implications. And these would be some of the things to consider as we move through these. First, to establish just courts. These would be things that the mitzvah, that the Hebrew rabbis of the time were also interested in. To refrain from cursing the name of God. Thirdly, to avoid idol worship. Fourthly, to avoid illicit sexual activities. Fifth, to refrain from murder. Sixth, to refrain from robbery. And seventh, never to eat the limbs of a living animal. So all of these were considered to be part of the law, considered, keep in mind here, as a gift, not as something binding upon the people, but rather something really which has the ability to liberate, and that God gives, as it were, a divine blueprint for how Israel as a people could develop. Now, these following sections are sometimes called antithesis, that is, contrary to one another. It might better be simply translated as contrasts. In other words, going from one side to the other. Jesus here extends, intensifies, and glosses the commandments. So the commandments are still staying there, or the instructions. And in summary, let's take this apart a little bit, the three that we are going to look at of the six. It's a command against adultery, forbidding lust. It's the instruction on how to divorce. Jesus tightens the marrying bond by permitting divorce only in the extreme case. And the commandment of taking false oaths, forbidding oaths, in fact. All right, let's look at this a little bit. First of all, the idea of murder. Well, Jesus says that quotes the law, that you should not be murdering. And then it goes on to say that if you are angry, that's what you should avoid. Now I'm just kind of summarizing here a rather long section, by the way, of Matthew that we will be listening to this time. So rather than just read this, I'm kind of summarizing some of the points here. Murder, one remembers, now it's not killing. Killing is one thing, although you could equate murder and killing, but murder is a deliberate act on the part of someone to do something to someone else. And Noah, going back to the famous story after the boat rescue from the ark, was told not to ever shed human blood. For the reason why human blood is not to be sacrificed is because the humans are made in the image of God. Now that, of course, even goes back earlier to one of the creation stories in Genesis itself. So people who, the difficulty with this, by the way, and this is probably something that we struggle with even in our own time, is that if you are not to murder anyone, then if you decide, and this could be either the community itself or the state, decides to execute the murderer, aren't you really violating the fact that the murderer is also made into the image of the Creator, into the image of God? And so that suggests that there needs to be another response to murder rather than execution. So you see, there's a certain ambiguity in some of the ways in which these teachings are presented. So one of the things that perhaps Jesus might be pictured as doing with the Torah is a phrase that is used by the rabbis in looking at how they expand an understanding of the Torah, that is, building a fence around the Torah. In order to do this, to build a fence, therefore, means let's look at it and see if there are some things within that fence, as it were. It's not to keep things out, but it's rather to improve things that are within. In this case, regarding murder and anger, the idea is, here are perhaps some thoughts that are connected here: be prudent in judgment, raise up many disciples, and therefore the fence protects what is inside. Violence, we need to do is to make it more difficult. And that's where the idea is that if one is not angry, one is less likely to commit murder. So see how Jesus here uses the idea of not becoming angry. Now, it's also true, there's always different aspects to look at here, that there is such thing as righteous anger. That's justified. And maybe the better translation here would be angry without cause. See, this would be what's called a gloss in the interpretation of this section. That one certainly could be, and maybe we should be, made angry by suffering, by cheating, by indifference, acts that are not human. So we have to be careful here about how anger is understood. But if it is thought of in terms of let we get back at those who have done some harm to us, then that is the fence that Jesus is placing around this commandment. You have heard that you shall not murder. The second one to look at here next is adultery. Now, it is true, and this is a delicate, well, not a delicate, but an important issue, but do try to keep in mind that adultery, as it is forbidden in the Torah, in the law, in the commandments, basically is considered to be when someone commits an adultery, and this would be an action by one who is married against, or one who is not married perhaps, against a woman who is married, that it is considered here, the woman, the wife, is considered to be the property of the husband. Now, these are interesting kind of reflections here. Jesus builds a fence around this, equating male lust with adultery. Now, lust or desire forbids the coveting of a neighbor's house, but here, as I mentioned, also a neighbor's property. And somehow this whole question of honor comes into play in this particular discussion. Now, it is true that the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 22 verses 24, says that those who are caught in the act of adultery should both be executed, okay? But more often what happened, if this were ever really done, is that the man escapes, the woman would be caught, and she could often be stoned. This was the recommendation of how execution should take place, by her father and her brothers, because she had brought shame to his family, to their family. So you see, this question of honor, this question of possession, lies behind much of the thinking here, which establishes this action about adultery. So Jesus, and then an interesting little addition in this section as we hear it, says, well, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. Now, Jesus, and I think you need to be, this is one of those sections here where those who want to interpret Scripture quite literally are going to run into a little bit of a problem. Is Jesus really suggesting bodily mutilation as a way to achieve some results here? And so what we smile a little bit and say, all right, this part here, perhaps we can see a little bit more allegorically, namely the metaphor. You got your attention here, literally. If I was going to say you see the point, well, it uses the eye as a kind of example. So those who are somewhat fundamental in interpreting every word of the New Testament are going to have to deal with a situation here and wonder sometimes how that explanation is made. But it is here an attempt, you see, to protect the property of the man. Now, when Jesus therefore argues against and sees the wrongness of adultery, it's not so much that and who has this lust? Well, the lust is considered to be in the eyes of the man, and therefore it is the man who needs to be careful here. So Jesus says that adultery is wrong, but, and you need to keep in mind here that, again, Matthew pictures Jesus as dealing with the understanding of situations in his own time and in his own place. But is Jesus in a certain way, now you have to be careful here we don't read into the text things that are not there, but is certainly saying that this action is wrong, not because, or is it some defense? I was going to say not because it violates dishonor, but because it violates, and this is important, the marriage covenant, which was considered to be very important in Israel's history, and all of that lies a little bit of a background here. Have to move around a little bit in this discussion because there are a number of issues that certainly come to the fore. Jesus is certainly here, and the law itself wanted to regulate behavior between and among the Israelites and wanted to minimize the potential annihilation of Israel as a result of internal honor-driven blood feuds. So you see, what Israel did not, why these kind of within the fence idea here were important, because if Israelites simply went around, and this goes back to the murder idea, simply kind of avenged themselves by killing someone who was violating my wife or things like that, what would happen? Yes, it is true that in an honor-based society, murder, theft, lying, and the like require retaliation. But Jesus, as we hear, offers his followers an honorable way out of situations that could lead to feuds and death. And you see, Israel's concern was if they killed one another, the whole nation would begin to diminish, and that's what you don't want. It goes back to the original invitation in the book of Genesis, given to Adam and Eve: increase and multiply and fill the earth. Well, if they're going to kill one another off, it's going to be very difficult to increase, isn't it? Now, the next talks about divorce, and it's pretty specific here. Divorced women, after remarriage, cannot return to their first husband. So you have a husband, the divorce is given, she marries another man, then decides that she wants to remarry him again, and that's specifically what the law or the Torah forbids. Marriage, we know, was a covenant. Paperwork was needed. Dissolution of relationships, which called in Hebrew a get, G-E-T, needed to take place in order for divorce to take place. Now, we've mentioned this before, and this little section does come up not only here, but later on also in Matthew's Gospel, as to exactly how a man, and again, keep in mind that this is a patriarchally organized system, how a man might get a bill of divorce. And what we do know, and we're not sure just exactly where Matthew's Jesus sided on this position, that there were two schools of thought, one from the house of Shammai and one from the house of Hillel. The house of Shammai argued that the only grounds for a bill of divorce being given to a man was adultery. And therefore, this placed restrictions on divorce. You really had only one legitimate claim for getting this agreement into effect. The house of Hillel, however, tended to have lesser restrictions on the divorce process. And we're not always clear what they were. We do have evidence later on in the Mishnah of what some of those words but it's important to remember that the Mishnah was created or put into effect at least 100 years after Jesus' time, and maybe even before Matthew's time, after Matthew's time. So we're not sure whether those understandings on Hillel, how prevalent they were in Jewish thought at the time. See, what I'm trying to say is that there is a certain ambiguity here in putting together an understanding of what's going on. Matthew, however, says, and this is where he differs from Mark and Luke, says that divorce is not allowed except for reasons of porneia, P-O-R-N-E-I-A. Now, what this term means, and this is where the interpreters find kind of differences, or where there's a vagueness, what exactly is to be understood by this exception? See, in other words, and this is the only gospel in which this word appears, and only in the teaching of Jesus here is remembered by Matthew. For that reason, a divorce could be granted. Well, there are really here a whole host of problems with understanding what this term means. It is therefore not simply infidelity. That, of course, would be in agreement with the Shammai position. But it also could be for terms of desertion, spousal abuse, loss of affection, maybe the husband and no longer, they never, that one of the partners carries on sexual activities with someone else. There's a discussion of gender identity, interestingly, a question which is certainly more out of our time, but could have been there. So what exactly is this exception, if one wants, that Matthew offers in Jesus' teaching. So, opposed to divorce, but I go back to the really idea here that divorce affected the honor of families, affected more a man's ability to do what he wished, breaking the relationship. And then a further issue arose of what happens to the divorced wife. What would she do? If she could remarry, that helped her future. Remember, women were therefore simply put out on their own. There were many things that they were not able to do in order to earn a living. They, in some ways, by being divorced, brought dishonor to their own family. So all of those were considerations that had to be made. So as you can see, as we've kind of wandered around a little bit, looking at these first 3 of 6 cases that are brought to our attention, yes, Jesus holds what might be considered a rather strict viewpoint or traditional viewpoint, but when he builds these fences around them, when he extends, murder through anger, the use of lust or on the part of men, I think he kind of can put this together without much further explanation. So, backing up a moment to verse 23 and 35 in what we're looking at this time, there is the case of debts, and what is used here is the quadrans, Q-U-A-N-D-R-A-N-S, the smallest coin of the Roman currency. So this section says that if you have a debt, before you take it to court, see if you can't solve the problem before you get there, because when you get there, then the fullness of that debt is going to have to be repaid. It is true that in the case of unpaid debts, imprisonment in the time of Judaism was somewhat rare. And so this seems to suppose a Roman law in this case, that if you can't pay, you're going to be imprisoned. So the value here that is brought out, certainly in this little section of the teaching, is the value of reconciliation with an enemy before it went to extremes. So as you can see, this little section offers a number of reflections, and I think we need to be careful that we do not judge modern times by looking at what was going on in the first century world. There's something I hope we have kind of illustrated here as we look at this section this time, is that what went on in the first century world is not necessarily the circumstances and situations, particularly when it comes to divorce in our own time. A question of honor, question of possession, those are kinds of issues that are not contemporary concerns, nor perhaps should they be. The first reading, just in leaving here today, comes from Sirach, which was a collection of proverbial teachings put together about 150 years before Jesus' time. And in it, its theory is what we call a theory of retribution. So it thought, and that perhaps is why this first reading is used for our attention, using images by the way of fire and water, life and death, good and evil, that we should always, according to thinking of Sirach, choose the good, and that will lead to what is beneficial. And we should avoid the bad, which leads to difficult circumstances. So all of that is a little bit, again, a brief introduction to another way of looking at things that I think the authors who put together the liturgy this time thought might be helpful when we reflected on Sirach. So let us try to keep, as best we can, the beautiful fencing of Jesus that he does with compassion and love in interpreting the law and bringing the instruction to a fuller understanding. We'll continue this discussion next time. Thank you for being with us.